We did it, boys and girls. We suffered through some Apex cards that were weaker than your uncle's homebrew IPA, and we have made it to the big one, UFC 300. T-Mobile Arena, Las Vegas. This card is more stacked than the plates on a Brock Lesnar deadlift, and it has sparked a bit of a debate online. MMA Twitter and Reddit been going back and forth talking about whether this might be the best card in MMA history, with a lot of people in favor and some pointing to the main event, Alex Pereira versus Jamal Hill, as just not stacking up compared to the other big marquee cards. So today, we're gonna do things a little bit differently and figure out once and for all if UFC 300 is the best card ever. I'm Max from MMA On Point. Thank you so much, as always, to our channel champion YouTube members, and this is the Unfamiliars for UFC 300. So yeah, to put it simply, there are no unfamiliars on this card. From top to bottom, it is names you probably know. So before we start comparing 300 to some cards from history, let's break down some fast facts about UFC 300. In 13 total fights, there are going to be 12 former or current UFC champions on this card. Yes, 12. It's impossible to build a top-heavy card with that number, especially considering the opening fight on the early prelims is between two former champions, Deiveson Figueiredo and Cody Garbrandt. In fact, the only fights on the card not featuring champions are fights with either legendary veteran status guys like Jim Miller versus Bobby Green, or fights with extremely exciting up-and-coming talents like Diego Lopez and Bo Nickel. So to put that into perspective, 12 champions on this card. Back at UFC 200, the last marquee event, there were only 9. And all the way back at UFC 100, there were only 5, and that's only if you're counting Dan Henderson as a tournament champion. Now, we all know that storylines make exciting fights, and there are some great ones going into UFC 300. Olympian and PFL champion Kayla Harrison is making her debut against former champion Holly Holm, making an extreme weight cut to do so, so there are a lot of questions to be answered there. Of course, we have Jim fucking Miller completing the trifecta of competing on UFC 100, 200, and 300, which all of us wanted to see. The first ever all-China world title fight is taking place with Weili Zhang and Zhao Nanyan. That is history being made right there. We have a BMF title fight between two of the most exciting fighters in the history of the sport, Justin Gaethje and Max Holloway, with everyone wondering how Max will fare this time back up at 155. And finally, the UFC is set to reveal some new glove technology to be used at UFC 300. Seems like they finally might be looking to fix those issues with eye pokes that have been plaguing the big show forever. So not only are these good fights on paper, but they have the intrigue and story building into them as well. There are a ton of cards we could talk about as being some of the best in history, but where better to start than with the UFC itself. Now, back in October last year for the 30th anniversary, UFC.com compiled a list of what they officially consider the best cards in history. So let's go through and have a look at them and compare them with UFC 300. So here we are, the 10 best fight cards of all time according to the UFC official website. First up, pretty obvious one, UFC 100. So let's have a look at that card. Obviously at the top, Brock Lesnar as champion. Brock obviously was coming into this one looking for revenge after Frank Mir knee-barred him in his first, and at that point only, loss in MMA. And obviously this is a massive fight, and at the time Brock was just in the peak of his stardom, and so was George St. Pierre, who defended his welterweight title against Thiago Alves in the co-main event. GSP and Brock were obviously both superstars at the absolute peaks of their powers. Dan Henderson versus Michael Bisping, coming into it, that would have been an interesting one, but more than that is just the knockout itself, still one of the greatest knockouts in UFC history. But once you get below that, it gets a little bit spotty. Fourth fight down, we've got John Fitch and Paulo Thiago. Sexy Armor taking on Alan Belcher. Mark Coleman versus Stephan Bonner as the featured prelim. That's a really interesting one, obviously. Kind of like a battle between eras, so that had a storyline going in. And John Jones took on Jake O'Brien, and at that point, you know, he would have been taking on that Diego Lopez, Bo Nickel kind of spot on the card as the up-and-coming guy. We weren't to know that he was going to end up becoming the GOAT. Of course, Jim Miller taking on Mac Danzig, and below that, again, it gets a bit spotty, ending on Shannon Gogarty versus Matt Grice. Obviously, looking back, that card was monumental, but I think it's fair to say that it was absolutely carried by the main event and co-main event being just stars. And the next fight the UFC has is UFC 129, St. Pierre versus Shields. Once again, GSP takes center stage. Obviously, this was just a massive event. It was the biggest UFC event in North American history at the time. Absolutely sold out, 55,000 tickets, massive gate. And when we look at the card from the top down, George St. Pierre, Jake Shields, obviously massive fight at the time. Jake Shields, Strikeforce champion, came in on a 13-fight win streak and was looking to take down the GOAT in his home country. Underneath that, Jose Aldo, Mark Hominick, great fight. Obviously, Jose Aldo's a huge name at the time, and that ended up being one of the closer fights of his career up to that point. Lyoto Machida, Randy Couture won. Again, in that third place spot, we have just another legendary knockout. Lyoto Machida, Randy Couture, that crane kick. But coming in, that definitely would have been an interesting fight. Randy, obviously long in the tooth, but a legend, and Lyoto, an up-and-coming dude with a really unique style. But after that, it really starts to drop off. Vladimir Matyushenko versus Jason Brills. Benson Henderson, a future champion, but at that point definitely wasn't any kind of name. And Mark Bocek. Rory Mack versus Nate Diaz was on the prelims. Obviously, looking back on it, those two became big stars in their own right. Other than that, though, going down, yeah, once again, it's a top-heavy card, and I think it's remembered mostly for just being a huge event on the night and the reaction of the crowd to George St. Pierre. Next up, and this one is a weird one, UFC Fight Night McGregor versus Brandao. Obviously, that was in Dublin, and this was probably right about when the UFC realized what a star they had in Conor McGregor. Obviously, he was still building up. Definitely hadn't broken into the mainstream like he has now. But again, I feel like this is being remembered based on the atmosphere rather than the card itself. Your co-main event was Gunnar Nelson versus Zach Cummings, Ian McCall versus Brad Pickett, and your fourth fight down is Norman Park versus now Yuki Kotani. Like, they really wanted to get the Europeans and the Irish in, but yeah, this one just doesn't even come close for me. Next up on the list, another Conor McGregor card, 189. His interim title shot against Chad Mendes. This one is remembered fondly by all MMA fans. Obviously, Conor McGregor's first crowning moment against Chad Mendes. And in the co-main event, one of the greatest fights of all time, Robbie Lawler versus Rory Mack. The whole main card ended in finishes, some amazing knees from the likes of Jeremy Stephens and Thomas Almeida. But again, underneath that main event and co-main, I just don't feel like Jeremy Stephens, Dennis Bermudez, Gunnar Nelson, Brandon Thatch, those kind of fights, they really don't hold up in comparison to what we've got going on this weekend. Some good up-and-comers, obviously, Thomas Almeida. Matt Brown was already a veteran at that point, but Cody Garbrandt made an appearance, but yeah, no, this one doesn't hold up either. Let's see what else they've got. Another McGregor one here, UFC 194, although they have decided to call him McGurger, which I might start doing as well. This one is definitely getting a little bit stronger on paper. Obviously, Conor McGregor, Jose Aldo was a massive fight at the time. Conor was starting to break into the mainstream. Under that, Luke Rockhold versus Chris Weidman, definitely the best fight you could make in the middleweight division at the time. Yoel Romero versus Jacare, who at that point, they were just equally as scary. That was kind of like a Romero versus Costa of back in the day. Demian Maia, Gunnar Nelson, two of the best jiu-jitsu guys ever getting matched up against one another. On paper, that's fantastic. Max Holloway and Jeremy Stephens, we knew those guys were going to throw down. Uriah Faber came back and took on Frankie Saenz on the prelims, and then again, it starts to weaken considerably. Just it falls apart a bit as you get back down to the prelims again. Next up, UFC 205. Now we're talking. Another McGregor appearance, but a landmark event for the UFC. Obviously, the first one since the legalization of MMA in New York, and it took place at the Mecca, Madison Square Garden. And this was peak Conor. Obviously, he lost to Diaz, but, you know, this was Gucci fur coat, stealing belts, peak madman Conor, which obviously is a massive star and a fantastic event as he became the first double champion. Woodley versus Stephen Thompson, that was an intriguing one on paper. Obviously, you want Ian Jacek continuing her prime run. Yoel Romero, Chris Weidman, another former champion, Rocky Pennington, Misha Tate. So there actually were 6 current or former champions on that main card, and then Frankie Edgar on the undercard, Khabib Nurmagomedov in his star-making performance, I reckon, against Michael Johnson. This one's definitely a lot stronger. I would put this up there for sure on my list, but I don't think those prelims can match up to what we've got coming this weekend. So now we've heard what the UFC thinks, but guys, here at MMA On Point, we are a channel of the people. We're the working class, the blue collar. We want to know what the UFC fans of the world consider the best cards in history, so we're gonna head over to Tapology, which has user-voted lists, and we're gonna have a look at what they say. The greatest MMA events of all time. So this has been contributed to by a bunch of people on Tapology. We can consider this kind of like the community's perception of it. At the top, obviously, UFC 100 still on there, 189, 205, 217. This was one I was really looking forward to talking about because this, watching live, was one of my favorite events. The second New York card in Madison Square Garden, the return of GSP after what felt like decades. TJ Dillashaw versus Cody Garbrandt, that match had the storyline, right? Former friends, former training partners, turned enemies. There was a lot of beef leading up to it. Same too in the third fight, Rose Namajunas, Joanna Jędrzejczyk. A lot of shit talk from Joanna. Rose was entering that phase where she became that mystical unbothered killer. Stephen Thompson versus Jorge Masvidal. This is definitely pre-Jorge Masvidal becoming a star in his own right. Stephen Thompson's always a fan favorite, and that matchup was really interesting. Paulo Costa emerged, murdering post-USADA Johnny Hendricks on this card. Those were all fantastic, but then as we go down, we get names like James Vick, like Mark Godbeer, Mickey Gall. Again, the same situation where it's quite top-heavy, but that main card was fantastic, and the atmosphere, especially at the end with GSP returning and winning, the way that he did it, it was fantastic. But we can't judge on the atmosphere because we're comparing it to a fight card that's happening in the future. This is just about how this would have looked to us coming up to it, and this one definitely one of the stronger ones so far, but the depth of competition just isn't there for me. Underneath that, we have the Ultimate Fighter 1 finale, which is a really interesting shout. Obviously, it was on free TV, but in terms of, you know, the storyline, the atmosphere, not leading up to it, but looking back, this is the card that saved the UFC. They got the TV deal, they got the mainstream appeal, mostly from Forrest Griffin taking on Stephan Bonner, two guys that would go on to be absolute legends. The main event that everyone forgets about, Rich Franklin knocking out a 400-year-old Ken Shamrock, and the other Ultimate Fighter final, Diego Sanchez, obviously, versus Kenny Florian. A fantastic moment in MMA history and the birth of some legends, right? But scroll down a bit, you get Sam Hoger taking on Bobby Southworth. That was the fourth fight on the card. Just don't feel like you can really consider this on the same level. Again, historically significant, but on paper, not as strong. 202, UFC 202, Diaz versus McGregor 2. The biggest main event in the world at the time, obviously. Anthony Johnson underneath it, murdering Glover Teixeira. Donald Cerrone turning in a performance of a lifetime against Rick Story. Mike Perry entering the public consciousness by screaming at Hyung-Gyu Lim and then knocking him out. Cody Garbrandt's star-making performance. He came out and murdered Takeya Mitsugaki. Went 10-0 undefeated. And I remember on the night, the finishes and the performance and the atmosphere around that main event were amazing, but on paper, doesn't even come close. They've got UFC 1 on here, but I don't think that's even worth comparing. You know, no one knew who anybody was at that point. It was a complete toss-up. Again, historically significant. Atmosphere on the night was probably incredible, but not what we're looking for. Here's one I do want to talk about. 229 Khabib versus McGregor. Now, this is the biggest event in history. 2.4 million buys, something like a $20 million gate. The best storyline maybe in the history of the sport. You know, how often do we get to talk about people throwing shit through bus windows to try and sell a fight? Co-main event, Tony Ferguson versus Anthony Pettis. But then I think we forget about how watered down it got as you went down. Obviously, Derek Lewis against anyone at that point, you're putting that fight on. Dominic Reyes, up-and-comer, went on to fight John Jones. Under that, Michelle Waterson versus Felice Herrig, Ducier Formiga versus Sergio Pettis. Yeah, and by the time you get down to the bottom, you got Anthony Rocco Martin taking on Ryan the Flair. Atmosphere, insane. Historical significance, insane. Drawing power, insane. But it's just about those two men. It's just about Conor and Khabib. You can't tell me Jamal Hill and Alex Pereira are the reason UFC 300 is so good. But that last event does bring me to my final point. The big argument by people who were disappointed by this card, it focuses around the main event. Alex Pereira versus Jamal Hill for the light heavyweight title. Let's be honest. Yes, these men aren't superstars. They aren't on that S-tier level, that Brock Lesnar, Conor McGregor level of transcending the sport. And if we're being honest, they might not even be another step down from that. The Israel Adesanya, the John Jones level in terms of star power, even inside the sport of MMA. And considering the rumors of who we could have had in the main event and how Dana White tried to hype up the announcement, I can understand the disappointment from this perspective. I mean, it could have been Conor versus Chandler, it could have been Adesanya versus Duplessis, or even a John Jones heavyweight title defense. And all of those are definitely bigger matchups in the MMA fans' mind than Pereira versus Hill. But this is where we get to the crux of the point that I want to make. MMA isn't boxing. We don't tune into these cards like boxing fans do to Floyd Mayweather. Nobody knows who is on the undercard of a Floyd Mayweather fight, and nobody cares. Most people don't even watch it. But in this sport, these cards don't rely on the star power of the main event anymore. Look back at UFC 200, right? Still a fantastic card, despite going from a main event of Conor versus Nate 2 to Jones versus Cormier 2 down to Tate versus Nunes. Now, with all due respect to Miesha Tate and a pre-GOAT status Amanda Nunes, that main event was just a few rungs down from what fans expected. We were all a little bit disappointed. The card was still stacked underneath it. Brock Lesnar making his return against Mark Hunt, Daniel Cormier versus Anderson Silva, that's a super fight right there. Jose Aldo, Frankie Edgar, two former champions, Cain Velasquez returning returning, TJ Dillashaw mounting a comeback. My point is, nobody tuned into UFC 200 just to watch Miesha Tate fight Amanda Nunes, because that's not what the sport is anymore. Cards can stand up for themselves and still be legendary and still be remembered in the consciousness of the MMA fan. And I think it's still hard to remember that in this day and age, because when these top heavy cards are staged and the big fights fall out, you know, injury, illness, cocaine, whatever it is, then the UFC's scrambling and it's their own fault. I think they've proven with UFC 300 that it is possible to stage a card that top to bottom is interesting and holds up on its own. Regardless of how you feel about it, when we go back and look at the best cards in history and stack them up against 300, I think we are looking at the best card in the history of the sport. I can't wait for all the comments. I'm sure I'm going to be told I'm wrong. Please hit me up at Max_Randall on Twitter if you want to tell me so. Thank you so much once again to our YouTube channel champions. You guys make videos like this happen. Obviously, if you want to throw a little bit of support towards the channel, you can do so. Click on that join button underneath the video or in the description. There's a whole bunch of cool perks you can get. Like and subscribe if you want to see more of this kind of content, and please enjoy the fights.